The morning of August 7th, 1944, somewhere in the hedgerow country of Normandy, a German Panzer commander named Hauptmann Ernst Barkmann stood atop his damaged Panther tank, scanning the horizon through binoculars. His crew had just destroyed their third Sherman that week, watching it brew up in the familiar gout of flame and black smoke that earned the American tank its grim nickname. Yet, as the smoke cleared, Barkmann's expression did not show triumph. Instead, his face betrayed something closer to despair, because rolling toward his position, visible even through the morning haze, were not 3 replacement Shermans but 12. And behind them, through gaps in the hedgerows, he could make out the shapes of dozens more. This was the moment that defined the Western Front for countless German tank crews. Not the technical specifications of armor thickness or gun penetration, but the simple, crushing realization that numbers could overwhelm quality. The question that would haunt German tankers through the final months of the war was not whether they could destroy American tanks, they had proven they could, but whether it mattered when those tanks seemed endless, flowing across Europe in a mechanical tide that never stopped, never faltered, and never ran dry. The German military had built its doctrine on the principle of qualitative superiority. Their panzers were engineering marvels, machines like the Panther and Tiger that could engage enemy armor at ranges where return fire was impossible. German crews trained for years, learning to maintain their temperamental machines and exploit every advantage their superior optics and guns provided. When a single Tiger tank could theoretically destroy a dozen Shermans in open combat, the mathematics seemed to favor Germany. But mathematics, the Germans would learn, was not measured only in kill ratios. It was also measured in production capacity, and in this equation, America held numbers that defied German comprehension. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. By the summer of 1944, American factories had transformed the industrial landscape into something unprecedented in human history. The numbers were staggering in ways that German intelligence struggled to believe. From 1942 through 1945, American production lines rolled out 49,234 Sherman tanks. To put this in perspective, Germany produced approximately 25,000 tanks of all types during the entire war. The Soviet Union, with its massive 34 program, built around 84,000 tanks, but operated on a single front. America was fighting a two-ocean war, supplying Britain and the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, and still managed to flood both the Pacific and European theaters with armor. The Sherman production figures represented more than mere manufacturing capacity. They revealed a fundamental transformation in how warfare could be waged. At the Chrysler Tank Arsenal in Detroit, workers assembled 1 Sherman every hour at peak production. The Fisher Body plant in Grand Blanc, Michigan, operated 24 hours a day, 3 shifts rolling off tanks with assembly line precision that would have seemed impossible to pre-war military planners. Ford's facility at River Rouge, already famous for automotive production, converted to military manufacturing and produced complete Sherman tanks, using the same mass production techniques Henry Ford had pioneered for automobiles. Each factory was a small city unto itself, employing tens of thousands of workers, many of them women who had never seen a factory floor before Pearl Harbor. What made American production truly revolutionary was not just the speed but the standardization. Unlike German tanks, which were often hand-fitted and required specialized parts, Shermans were designed for interchangeability. Any component from one factory could fit a tank from another. Tracks, engines, transmissions, all were standardized to such a degree that field maintenance became dramatically simpler than anything German crews experienced. This seemingly mundane detail would prove strategically decisive. When a Sherman threw a track or broke down, replacement parts arrived within days. When a Panther or Tiger suffered mechanical failure, crews often waited weeks for custom components to be manufactured and shipped from Germany, assuming the parts could be produced at all given Allied bombing campaigns. The German General Staff received reports about American production figures throughout 1943 and 44, but many officers dismissed them as propaganda or Allied disinformation. The numbers seemed impossible. How could a nation build tanks faster than they could be destroyed? Some German commanders convinced themselves that the reports were inflated by factors of 3 or 4, that perhaps America was building 15,000 tanks, not 50,000. This was a comfortable delusion. It allowed German planners to continue believing that superior German engineering and tactical skill could offset numerical disadvantages. But the evidence arriving from the front told a different story. After the Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, German reconnaissance units began sending reports that shook even the most optimistic analysts. Aerial photographs showed tank parks stretching for miles behind the beachheads. Railroad yards in England, visible through gaps in cloud cover, revealed hundreds of Shermans awaiting transport to France. Captured American soldiers, when interrogated, spoke casually of endless columns of armour moving through England, describing supply depots, where tanks were stored in lots so large that individual vehicles were assigned grid coordinates just to locate them. One Wehrmacht intelligence report from July 1944, preserved in post-war archives, attempted to calculate American armour strength in Normandy. The analyst estimated between 3,000 and 4,000 tanks deployed in the first 6 weeks after D-Day. He concluded his report with a note that became famous in German military circles. If these figures are accurate, and prisoner interrogations suggest they are, then the enemy possesses reserves of armour that exceed our total production capacity for the current year. This presents strategic implications that cannot be overcome through tactical superiority alone. For the men in the tanks, the implications were even more immediate and personal. German tank commanders like Barkmann, who had fought in Russia and France, began to recognize a pattern that filled them with dread. They could win individual engagements, destroy 3 or 4 or even 10 enemy tanks in a single action, only to watch fresh American armour appear within hours. It was like fighting the ocean. Every wave you broke was followed by another and another, each one carrying the same overwhelming force. Survivors of Panzer units described the psychological toll of this realization in their post-war memoirs. One Panther commander wrote, "We destroyed so many Shermans that we lost count. Our crew became skilled at predicting where they would burn, how the ammunition would cook off, the angle at which the turret would blow free." But this knowledge brought no comfort, because by the 3rd week in France, we understood that for every Sherman we destroyed, 2 more would arrive by morning. And when our Panther was finally hit, there would be no replacement. We were fighting a war of mathematics, and the equation had already been solved against us. The contrast in production philosophy revealed deeper differences between the two industrial systems. Germany had chosen to build smaller numbers of technologically superior vehicles, tanks that required precision manufacturing, exotic materials, and skilled assembly. The Tiger tank, perhaps the most feared vehicle on the battlefield, required so much machining time and specialized labor that Germany produced only about 1,300 during the entire war. Each Tiger represented hundreds of man-hours and resources that could have built multiple simpler vehicles. The Panther, more numerous but still complex, suffered from constant mechanical problems due to rushed development and over-engineering. America, by contrast, had opted for simplicity and mass production. The Sherman was not the most heavily armoured tank, nor did it mount the most powerful gun, but it was reliable, easy to maintain, and could be produced in quantities that overwhelmed any qualitative advantage. The M4 Sherman used a proven engine design, the Continental R975 Radial, that was already in mass production for aircraft. Its suspension was simple and durable. Its armour, while not thick enough to stop German 88mm guns, was adequate against most threats and could be angled to increase effectiveness. Most importantly, it worked. Shermans started reliably, ran for hundreds of miles without major maintenance, and when they did break down, any competent crew could perform repairs using standard tools and readily available parts. This difference in philosophy extended to crew training as well. German tankers trained for months or even years, learning the intricacies of their complex machines and developing the skills to exploit every technical advantage. American crews received condensed training, typically 3 to 4 months, focusing on basic competency and teamwork rather than virtuoso performance. The American system assumed that tanks would be lost and crews would need replacement. The Germans, with their limited production, could not afford such losses, and therefore invested heavily in each individual crew and vehicle. The mathematics of attrition thus favored America from the start. Even when German tanks achieved kill ratios of 3 to 1 or higher, the calculus worked against them. If a Tiger destroyed 3 Shermans before being knocked out, Germany had lost an irreplaceable vehicle that took months to manufacture, while America had lost 3 tanks that could be replaced within days. The strategic reserve of German armour steadily diminished, while American reserves grew larger with each passing month. By August 1944, as Allied forces broke out of the Normandy beachhead and raced across France, the full weight of American production became impossible to ignore. German units reported being surrounded by enemy armour, not because of clever tactics, but simply because American tanks were everywhere. Roads, fields, villages. Every position seemed to have Shermans either occupying it or approaching it. German commanders found themselves unable to maneuver because any movement revealed their positions to waiting American tanks, and any engagement, even if won, left them weaker for the next inevitable encounter. The psychological impact on German crews was devastating. Veterans who had fought in Russia described a different kind of dread on the Western Front. Against the Soviets, they had faced human wave attacks, terrifying in their scale but ultimately manageable, if you held your position and maintained fire discipline. Against the Americans, the waves were mechanical, relentless, and backed by seemingly infinite logistics. Crews began to describe the feeling of hopelessness that settled over them when, after destroying several Shermans, they would hear the distinctive rumble of more approaching. Some reported that the sound of American tank engines, the throaty roar of radial aircraft engines repurposed for armour, became a source of anxiety even when they were supposedly in safe rear areas. One Panzer grenadier lieutenant, interviewed after the war, described a conversation he had with a Tiger commander in late August 1944. The Tiger had just returned from an engagement where it had destroyed 5 Shermans without suffering damage. The crew should have been celebrating, but instead the commander sat on his tank's fender, staring at nothing, and said simply, "There were 20 more behind them, always 20 more. We cannot win this." This was the moment when morale began to fracture, not because German soldiers lacked courage or skill, but because they had begun to understand the industrial reality of their situation. Germany was fighting an opponent that could replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. Every tactical victory was strategically meaningless because the enemy's reserves were effectively unlimited. The war had become an equation with only one possible outcome, and that outcome was German defeat through sheer material exhaustion. The numbers told a story that no amount of propaganda could obscure. By September 1944, American forces in Europe operated approximately 20 tank battalions, each nominally equipped with 72 Shermans. In practice, most battalions operated above strength, with reserve vehicles available to replace losses immediately. German intelligence estimated that the Allies could field between 5,000 and 6,000 tanks on the Western Front at any given moment, with thousands more in reserve in England and hundreds arriving from American production lines each week. Against this, Germany had perhaps 1,000 operational tanks on the entire Western Front, divided among units that were chronically under strength and struggling to maintain their vehicles in the face of mechanical failures and parts shortages. The disparity was even more striking when considering the broader picture. America was simultaneously supporting the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, shipping tanks, vehicles, and supplies that helped sustain the Red Army's offensives in the East. The United States was also fighting Japan in the Pacific, deploying substantial armour to islands and supporting Australian and British forces in Burma and India. Despite this global commitment, American production was so robust that there were often more tanks awaiting shipment than there were transport ships available to carry them. Photographs from American ports in 1944 show acres of Shermans parked in neat rows, waiting their turn to be loaded onto Liberty ships bound for Europe. For German logisticians, these images, obtained through intelligence channels, were more demoralizing than battlefield defeats. They revealed an enemy whose industrial capacity was so vast that the limiting factor wasn't production, but transportation. Germany, by contrast, was rationing steel, simplifying designs to save materials, and cannibalizing damaged vehicles for parts to keep others running. The Third Reich was fighting a war of scarcity while America waged a war of abundance. The breaking point for many German units came during the failed Ardennes offensive in December 1944, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler had gambled on a massive armoured thrust through the Ardennes forest, hoping to split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace. German planners had assembled their last strategic reserves, stripping the Eastern Front and scraping together every operational tank they could muster. The offensive initially achieved surprise, and German panzers surged through American lines, creating panic in the Allied rear areas. But within days, the material reality reasserted itself. American forces, reeling from the surprise attack, nevertheless managed to rush reinforcements to critical points. Tank destroyers, Shermans, and infantry anti-tank weapons arrived at Street, Veith and Bastogne faster than German forces could advance. More importantly, the weather cleared after a week, allowing Allied aircraft to resume operations. When German columns were spotted, they were subjected to devastating air attacks that destroyed vehicles faster than ground combat ever could. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. But even without the air attacks, the ground reality was crushing. One German officer, commanding a battalion of Panthers during the Bulge, later described the experience in his memoir. His unit began the offensive with 42 operational tanks. By the third day, they had destroyed perhaps 30 American vehicles, but had lost 18 Panthers to combat and mechanical failure. By the fifth day, only 12 Panthers remained operational. They were ordered to continue the advance, but found their path blocked by fresh American armor, entire battalions that had been rushed from other sectors. The officer wrote, "We had achieved a local tactical success, but the tension? Americans simply moved units from quiet sectors to oppose us. They had the luxury of choice. We had only the single gamble that was already failing." The Ardennes offensive collapsed not because German soldiers fought poorly, but because the mathematical reality of American production could not be overcome. For every German tank lost, there was no replacement. For every American tank destroyed, another arrived within days, sometimes hours. By January 1945, the German forces that had begun the offensive as a powerful armoured spearhead were reduced to scattered remnants, hiding in forests and abandoned villages, waiting for fuel that would never come and replacements that didn't exist. In the aftermath, captured German tank commanders spoke openly about the futility of their position. One Panther commander, taken prisoner in January 1945, told his American interrogators, "Your tanks are inferior to ours in almost every technical measure, but you have so many that technical superiority is irrelevant. We calculated that each of our tanks was worth 3 of yours, but you built 50 for every one of ours. How do we fight that mathematics?" This question had no answer that German industry or tactics could provide. The fundamental equation of the war had been determined not on battlefields but in factories, in Detroit and Grand Blanc and Cleveland, where shifts of American workers produced more tanks in a month than Germany could build in a year. The Sherman may not have been the most sophisticated tank of the war, but it didn't need to be. It was good enough, and there were enough of them to overwhelm any opponent through sheer numerical superiority. As winter turned to spring in 1945, German resistance in the West crumbled. Units that had once been proud panzer divisions were reduced to scratch forces, cobbled together from survivors and supported by antiquated vehicles pressed into service from training depots. American armor, by contrast, rolled forward with fresh paint and full fuel tanks, spearheading advances that covered dozens of miles in a single day. The sight of endless columns of Shermans became so common that German civilians fleeing westward barely registered them, just another component of the overwhelming American presence. The final truth that German tank crews had to confront was perhaps the most psychologically devastating. All their training, all their technical superiority, all their tactical skill, none of it mattered against an enemy who could lose 10 tanks and simply build 20 more. The war had never been about individual engagements or the quality of machines. It had always been about industrial capacity, and in that contest, Germany had lost before the first shot was fired. The Sherman tank, derided by some historians as mediocre, had proven to be the perfect weapon for America's way of war. Not because it was the best tank, but because it was good enough and America could build it in numbers that made opposition mathematically impossible. 49,234 Shermans, each one a testament to American industrial power, each one another nail in the coffin of German ambitions. The German tank crews who survived the war carried this knowledge with them, the memory of an enemy who could not be defeated because they could not be outproduced, and the bitter realization that courage and skill meant nothing against the cold calculus of industrial mathematics. By the early months of 1945, the psychological collapse of German armoured forces was nearly complete. What had once been proud Panzer divisions, the spearhead of blitzkrieg that had terrorized Europe, were now hollow formations existing more on paper than in reality. Unit designations that once commanded 90 or 100 tanks now fielded perhaps a dozen operational vehicles, often a mix of different types cobbled together from whatever could be salvaged or scraped from depot stocks. Crews who had trained on Panthers found themselves assigned to captured French tanks or obsolete Panzer Mark IIIs pulled from training schools. The desperation was visible in every aspect of German armour operations. The contrast with American forces became starker with each passing week. As German units disintegrated, American armour seemed to multiply. By March 1945, when Allied forces crossed the Rhine, entire armoured divisions rolled across pontoon bridges in displays of strength that left German defenders stunned. Survivors watching from bunkers and concealed positions described the sight in terms usually reserved for natural disasters. One Wehrmacht soldier, interviewed decades later, remembered watching an American armoured column cross at Remagen. "They came for 6 hours," he said. 6 continuous hours of tanks, tank destroyers, half-tracks, and supply vehicles. We counted over 300 Shermans alone, and this was just one, crossing point. We heard similar reports from up and down the river. It was like watching an endless parade, except the parade was bringing our destruction. The logistics supporting this American armour was itself a marvel that German planners struggled to comprehend. Behind every Sherman at the front stood an elaborate supply chain that stretched back across the Atlantic Ocean to American factories. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and replacement vehicles flowed in quantities that seemed fantastical to German observers accustomed to rationing and scarcity. American tank battalions operated with the assumption that maintenance would be continuous and resupply would be immediate. When a Sherman threw a track or suffered engine trouble, the crew knew that a repair vehicle would arrive within hours, carrying the exact parts needed. When ammunition ran low, supply trucks appeared as if summoned, their loads calculated based on expected consumption rates tracked by efficient logistics and officers. German units, by comparison, operated in a state of constant crisis. Fuel was so scarce that tanks often couldn't move even when tactically necessary. Ammunition was rationed to the point where crews were ordered to fire only when certain of a hit. Spare parts existed only through cannibalization, taking components from destroyed vehicles to keep others running. One Panzer mechanic, captured in April 1945, described the absurdity of his final weeks. His unit had received a shipment of replacement tracks for their Panthers, except the tracks were the wrong size, meant for an earlier model. Rather than send them back and wait for correct parts that would never arrive, the mechanics attempted to modify the tracks with hand tools, a process that took days and resulted in unreliable repairs that failed under combat stress. The American system, by contrast, operated with industrial precision. Depot stocks in France and Belgium contained tens of thousands of spare parts, organized and catalogued so that any component could be located and shipped within 24 hours. Maintenance battalions operated mobile repair facilities that could rebuild a Sherman's engine or replace a transmission in a matter of hours, work that would have taken German workshops days or weeks if they had the parts at all. This logistical superiority was as decisive as any battlefield victory, ensuring that American armor remained operational while German tanks slowly degraded into immobility. The human cost of this disparity weighed heavily on German tank crews. By early 1945, survival rates had plummeted. Crews who had once expected to fight until their tanks were destroyed now hoped merely to survive until they could surrender. Diaries and letters from this period reveal a profound shift in mentality. Early in the war, Panzer crews had written with pride about their machines and confidence in their superiority. By 1945, the same men wrote with resignation and despair. One letter, preserved in military archives, was written by a Tiger commander in February 1945. "We have become hunters, who are now the hunted," he wrote. "Our great cats, once so feared, are now museum pieces surrounded by scavengers. The Americans have so many tanks that they use them as scouts, sending them forward carelessly because they know 10 more wait behind each one. We preserve our last Tiger like a religious relic, moving it only at night, hiding it during the day, knowing that once it enters battle, it will never leave. Not because we lack courage, but because we lack fuel, ammunition, and the hope that another Tiger will ever replace it." This letter captured the essence of German armoured warfare in the final months of the war. Tank crews had become custodians of irreplaceable machines, tasked with husbanding resources that could never be replenished while facing an enemy whose resources seemed infinite. The psychological burden was crushing. Crews described feeling like they were fighting with one hand tied behind their backs, possessing theoretically superior weapons but unable to use them effectively because of shortages and overwhelming enemy numbers. The American numerical advantage manifested in tactics that would have been unthinkable for German forces. American commanders could afford to be aggressive, even reckless, because losses were acceptable. If a reconnaissance in force cost 3 Shermans to discover enemy positions, those tanks would be replaced before the main assault began. If an attack failed and a dozen tanks were lost, a second attack with fresh armor could be launched the next day. This tactical flexibility derived entirely from industrial capacity. American officers planned operations knowing that material losses were temporary inconveniences, not strategic disasters. German commanders had no such luxury. Every tank committed to battle was a precious asset that might determine the outcome of an entire sector's defense. Losing a single Panther could mean losing the ability to counterattack or hold a critical position. This forced German armor into increasingly passive roles, held in reserve until the perfect moment that never seemed to arrive. Crews sat in camouflaged positions, engines silent to conserve fuel, watching as American armor maneuvered freely across the battlefield. The frustration was maddening. They possessed capable weapons but couldn't use them effectively because doing so meant losing them forever. The accounts of specific engagements in early 1945 reveal this dynamic with stark clarity. Near the town of Hildesheim in April, a German Kampfgruppe that included 3 operational Panthers attempted to block an American advance. The Panthers were positioned in a tree line overlooking open ground, their crews confident they could destroy any American tanks that appeared. When the Americans attacked, the German crews did exactly what they had trained for, methodically destroying the lead Shermans at long range. 5, then 7, then 10 American tanks burned in the fields. But the American column didn't stop or retreat. More Shermans pushed forward, flanking the Panther's position, while artillery fire forced the German crews to button up. Within an hour, all 3 Panthers were destroyed or abandoned, their crews fleeing on foot. The American unit that overwhelmed them had started with 42 tanks. They lost 13 in the engagement, called it an acceptable loss, and continued their advance with 29 Shermans still operational. By the next morning, Replacement tanks had arrived from division reserves, and the unit was back to full strength. The Germans, meanwhile, had lost 3 of their few remaining Panthers and had no possibility of replacing them. This pattern repeated across the entire Western Front throughout March and April of 1945. German armour units fought desperately, often achieving impressive kill ratios, but ultimately being ground down by sheer attrition. American units absorbed losses that would have crippled German formations and continued operating at near full strength, thanks to constant resupply. The mathematics of the war had become brutally simple. America could afford losses. Germany could not. Therefore, Germany would lose. Captured German tank commanders, when interrogated by American intelligence officers, spoke with a mix of bitterness and grudging respect. One Panther commander, captured after the Ruhr pocket collapsed in April 1945, was asked why he had surrendered when his tank was still operational. His answer was telling. "What was the point of continuing?" he said. "We had no fuel for more than 20 kilometers of travel. We had 17 armor-piercing rounds remaining. Even if we destroyed 10 of your tanks, you would send 20 more, and when we ran out of ammunition, we would sit helpless, waiting to be destroyed. Better to surrender with dignity than to die pointlessly." This pragmatic acceptance of defeat was widespread among German armoured forces by the war's end. The propaganda about secret weapons and final victory had lost all credibility. Crews understood the reality of their situation. They were fighting an enemy who could replace every loss multiple times over, while they scraped together spare parts and rationed ammunition. The question was no longer whether Germany would lose, but how long until the inevitable surrender. The American advantage extended beyond the tanks themselves to the entire support infrastructure. Sherman crews were fed regularly with rations that, while often mocked by the soldiers themselves, provided adequate nutrition and variety. German tank crews by 1945 were often subsisting on reduced rations, supplemented by whatever they could forage or barter for. American crews received regular rest periods, rotated off the line for maintenance and recuperation. German crews stayed with their tanks until they were destroyed or captured, exhaustion adding to their other difficulties. Medical care represented another stark contrast. American tankers knew that if wounded, they would receive immediate attention from well-equipped medics, evacuation to field hospitals with trained surgeons, and, if necessary, transport to hospitals in England or even the United States. German crews understood that serious wounds often meant death, as medical supplies dwindled and hospitals were overwhelmed. This knowledge affected morale in subtle but significant ways. American crews fought knowing they would be cared for if injured. German crews fought knowing they might die from wounds that would be survivable with adequate medical attention. The psychological impact of constant aerial observation and attack further demoralized German armor forces. By 1945, the Luftwaffe was essentially non-existent as a fighting force. The skies belonged entirely to Allied aircraft, which roamed freely, hunting for any German vehicles that dared move during daylight. American armoured columns advanced under continuous air cover, with fighters and fighter-bombers on call to strike any German resistance. German tanks were forced to move only at night, crawling along back roads in hopes of avoiding detection, hiding under trees or in barns during the day. This constant aerial threat meant that even when German tanks were operationally ready, they often couldn't be used effectively. A Panther, hidden in a forest, was safe but useless. Moving to an engagement position meant risking detection and destruction from the air long before engaging enemy armor. American crews, by contrast, called in airstrikes whenever they encountered resistance, knowing that fighter bombers would arrive within minutes to soften up targets before the armor advanced. The integration of air and ground forces gave American units a decisive advantage that German forces could not counter. The final weeks of the war saw German tank crews facing impossible choices. Orders came from increasingly out-of-touch commanders to hold positions or launch counterattacks with forces that existed only on paper. Crews with no fuel were ordered to advance. Units with a handful of operational tanks were expected to stop entire American divisions. The disconnect between command expectations and ground reality was complete. Many crews simply ignored orders they knew were suicidal, hiding their tanks and waiting for the war to end. Others attempted to follow orders and were quickly destroyed or forced to surrender when they ran out of fuel or ammunition. One particularly poignant account comes from a Tiger commander near Munich in late April 1945. His unit had been ordered to counterattack an American spearhead, despite having only enough fuel for perhaps 15 kilometers of movement and no prospect of resupply. The commander gathered his crew and asked for their opinion. To a man, they said they saw no point in dying in a futile gesture. The commander agreed. They drove their Tiger into a ravine, set demolition charges, and walked away before detonating the explosives. When captured 2 days later, the commander told his interrogators, "I refuse to waste the lives of my crew fighting your endless ranks of Shermans. We would have destroyed perhaps 3 or 4 before we were overwhelmed. What purpose would that serve? The war is lost. It was lost the moment your factories began producing tanks in thousands while ours built them in hundreds." This sentiment was echoed throughout German armoured forces. The recognition that industrial capacity, not battlefield prowess, would determine the war's outcome had become universal. Crews who had once taken pride in their technical superiority now understood that superiority was meaningless against an opponent who could sustain losses indefinitely while they could not. The mathematics had spoken, and the answer was German defeat. The American advance through Germany in April and early May 1945 presented German civilians with visual proof of American material superiority. Endless columns of Shermans rolled through German towns and cities, their tracks chewing up cobblestone streets, their crews waving to stunned onlookers. For civilians who had been told for years that German technology was unmatched, the sight of thousands upon thousands of American tanks was a profound shock. One German housewife in Bavaria wrote in her diary about watching American armor pass through her village for an entire day. "I counted more than 200 tanks," she wrote, "and my neighbor said she had seen similar numbers the day before in the next village. Where do they all come from? How can one nation possess so many machines?" The answer, which German civilians were beginning to grasp, was that they had been fighting an industrial colossus whose productive capacity dwarfed anything Germany could achieve. The neat rows of Shermans, the well-fed American crews, the casual abundance of supplies and equipment, all testified to a level of industrial organization and output that Germany had never matched. The contrast with German forces, exhausted and equipped with obsolete or damaged equipment, could not have been more stark. Post-war interrogations of German tank crews revealed the lasting psychological impact of facing American numerical superiority. Many expressed that the most demoralizing aspect was not the combat itself, but the certain knowledge that victory was impossible. One veteran explained it this way: "In Russia, we knew the Soviets had many tanks, but they were poorly made and easily destroyed. We could win battles through superior tactics and equipment. Against the Americans, we still had superior equipment in many cases, but it didn't matter. They had acceptable tanks in numbers we could never match. Every battle we won made us weaker. Every battle they lost made them barely notice. How do you maintain morale fighting an enemy who treats serious losses as minor inconveniences?" This question cut to the heart of Germany's strategic failure. The decision to prioritize quality over quantity, to build small numbers of sophisticated vehicles rather than large numbers of adequate ones, had doomed German armor to eventual defeat. The Tigers and Panthers were indeed superior tanks in many respects, but Germany built too few to matter strategically. America's decision to mass-produce the Sherman, accepting its limitations in exchange for overwhelming numbers, proved strategically sound. The Sherman was good enough to fight effectively, reliable enough to minimize maintenance issues, and produced in sufficient quantities to replace losses faster than they occurred. The final accounting of the tank war in Europe thus came down to industrial mathematics rather than battlefield performance. German tank crews had fought skillfully and bravely, often achieving tactical victories against numerical odds. But strategy is not measured in tactical victories. It is measured in the ability to sustain operations, to replace losses, and to maintain pressure until the enemy collapses. By these measures, the Sherman tank was the decisive weapon, not because it was the best tank, but because it was good enough, and America built 49,234 of them. In the war's immediate aftermath, as prisoners were processed and units disbanded, German tank veterans struggled to reconcile their battlefield experiences with the outcome. They had destroyed thousands of Allied tanks, yet they had lost. They had operated superior equipment, yet they had been overwhelmed. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Some clung to the belief that political betrayal or strategic mistakes had cost Germany victory. Others, more perceptive, recognized that the war had been decided in Detroit and Grand Blanc as much as on the battlefields of France and Germany. One former Panther commander, reflecting on his experience years later, articulated the lesson that many had learned. "We were craftsmen fighting a factory," he said. "Every tank we built was a work of precision engineering. Every tank they built was a product of assembly lines. We made masterpieces. They made thousands. In the end, thousands of adequate machines defeated hundreds of excellent ones. This is the nature of modern war. Industrial capacity matters more than individual quality. We learned this lesson at terrible cost." This understanding would influence post-war military doctrine in profound ways. The American model of mass production and standardization became the template for armored warfare in the decades that followed. The Soviet Union, already inclined toward massive production, reinforced its commitment to building tens of thousands of T-54s and T-62s. Western nations, including the reformed West German Bundeswehr, adopted doctrines that emphasized sustainability and replaceability over individual vehicle superiority. The lesson of the Sherman had been absorbed. Wars of attrition favor the side that can sustain losses and continue operations. For the German tank crews who survived the war, memories of endless American Shermans haunted them for decades. In veteran gatherings and memoirs, the same themes recurred: the frustration of winning tactical engagements but losing strategically, the psychological toll of facing an enemy whose resources seemed infinite, and the bitter recognition that courage and skill could not overcome industrial disparity. Many expressed grudging respect for American productive capacity, even as they mourned comrades who had died fighting impossible odds. The Sherman tank, maligned in some historical accounts as inferior to German armor, had accomplished its strategic purpose completely. It had equipped American forces with sufficient armor to overwhelm German resistance through sheer numerical superiority. It had proven reliable enough that American logistics could sustain operations across thousands of miles of supply lines, and it had been produced in quantities that made German counterattacks futile and German defensive positions untenable. The Sherman was not the war's best tank, but it was the war's most important tank, the vehicle that embodied America's way of war and delivered victory through industrial might. The legacy of the Sherman production program extended far beyond military history. It demonstrated that modern warfare had become fundamentally industrial, that factory output mattered as much as battlefield tactics. The nation that could mobilize its industrial base most effectively would possess decisive advantages that battlefield skill alone could not overcome. This lesson shaped Cold War military planning and continues to influence defense policy today. The Sherman tank represented a revolution in military affairs, not through technological innovation, but through manufacturing scale. For Germany, the lesson was learned too late and at catastrophic cost. The decision to build small numbers of sophisticated weapons had left them unable to sustain the long war of attrition that developed. By the time German planners recognized the mistake, American factories were already producing Shermans in thousands, and there was no way to close the gap. The war had been decided not by who built the best tank, but by who built the most tanks that were good enough. America had answered that question definitively, with 49,234 Shermans, each one a reminder that in industrial warfare, quantity has a quality all its own. The German tank crews who faced this steel tsunami understood the truth even as they fought against it. They were not defeated by superior tactics or better equipment. They were defeated by mathematics, by the simple equation of American productive capacity versus German manufacturing limits. It was an equation they could not solve, an enemy they could not overcome, and a reality they finally had to accept when the last Panther fell silent and the last Tiger was abandoned for lack of fuel. The age of the craftsman-built tank had ended, the age of mass-produced armor had arrived, and that age belonged to America and its endless columns of Sherman tanks. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.